Hey everyone! In this week's video, I wanted to go over the steps I like to take when it comes to preparing to start a large full coverage piece, which include things like where I source my materials, how I calculate and cut my fabric to size, and the way I like to organize my floss. So without further ado, let's talk about it. So any cross-stitch PDF pattern will list out the colors and skein estimates you'll need in the first couple of pages. And using that information, I can go online and order all of my floss. Now for this project, I decided to use 123stitch.com because they make it very easy to search up the DMC color code and choose how many skeins you would like. And that's how I got all of my floss for this project, which will need some organization later on, but at least we've got all the floss now. And for the fabric, I decided to use Sew Crane, which is another online shop, and I decided to go with a 25 count fabric for this project. And it's important to know the fabric count because we'll need it later on when we're calculating the final fabric size we'll need. So the first step in preparing your fabric is calculating just how much you'll need to cut out. And to do this, you'll need to know how many stitches wide your pattern is, how many stitches tall, and your fabric count. So for this example, I'm using this pattern, which is 369 stitches wide by 724 stitches tall, and I'll be using a 25 count fabric. And another important thing you'll need to know is how much margin you'd like to add to your fabric. I like to use a margin of 3 inches on all sides of my fabric to give me room to frame and also hold my fabric while I'm stitching it. So using this information, I can calculate how tall my final piece of fabric will be by taking the amount of stitches in the height, dividing it by the fabric count, and adding 6 inches for the margin on each side. So for this, it will be 724 stitches tall, divided by a 25 count fabric, and plus 6 inches. So my final fabric will need to be about 35 inches tall. So let me write that down. And similarly for the width, I will take the number of stitches in the width, divide it by my fabric count, and add 6 to account for the margins. I'm just going to go ahead and round up to the nearest inch to make my life easier. Alright, so after doing these calculations, I know that my final fabric will need to be 21 inches wide by 35 inches tall. So let's go ahead and cut that out. So here I am laying out my entire piece of fabric and measuring out that 35 by 21 inch cut we measured earlier. And once I'm done cutting that out, I'm just going to give it a quick press to get rid of some of the fold lines that were in the original fabric. Now that I've got my fabric cut to size, I'm going to finish off the edges with a zigzag stitch to prevent them from fraying as I'm working on the project. If you don't have a sewing machine, you can also use liquid stitch or fray away to seal off the edges. Or I've also seen people use masking tape to seal the edges. Anything to keep them from unraveling your project will work. Once we finish off the edges using our method of choice, we're pretty much done with fabric preparation, which means it's time for our next step, which is floss organization. Now, I've tried a couple of different ways to organize my floss in the past. The first of these was using floss away bags, but I found I don't like having to open up the bag each time I want to access my thread. Then the next system I've tried is using these floss drops. This one I really like because to access thread on a floss drop is super easy. You just hook your needle under one strand of thread. Give me 1 minute here. You just gotta hook your needle under one strand of thread and pull it, and it just comes out like that. You're ready to start stitching with it. So I knew I wanted something with the easy access to thread like the floss drops give me, but just have more space because I won't be able to fit all 88 colors on a single ring like the one I have here. So that's why for this project I decided to go with these floss cards, which I'll be able to tie the threads on like I have with the floss drops, but I'll just have a lot more spaces to store all of my colors. So yeah, let's get into processing all of my thread. Here I am just quickly labeling all of my floss card spaces, and I'm labeling them in the same order they appear in the pattern. which makes it easier for me to find the colors I'm looking for. And once I'm done with that, I'm ready to start loading them up with all of my skeins. Okay, so here's how I'm preparing each one of my skeins. First, I'm just gonna let it unravel. I let it drop to the floor, and I'm holding onto the end, and I'm gonna pull it through till I reach the other end. I've reached the other end. I'm just gonna let them meet together. I'm gonna fold it in half 3 times. Here's the other end. That's 2 folds. Now I need 1 more. And that's my 3rd fold. So after I fold my skein in half 3 times, I'm just going to cut these loops at the end, and that'll create the lengths that I like to stitch with. There we go. And then I'll fold it in half 1 more time, and to attach it to the floss guard, first I will just loop this through the hole. There you go. See, I've grabbed the tails through the loop. I'm just going to pull them through. There we go. And I'll tighten that up a little bit. So now I've got my floss ready. Now I just got to do it for all the rest of the colors. Now this was definitely the most time-consuming part of this entire process, but I know by pre-cutting all of my floss beforehand, it will make stitching on this project a lot more enjoyable for me. So future me will thank me for putting in all this work. It is a couple of hours later, but I did manage to finish putting all of my floss onto the floss cards today. And now that I have my fabric all cut out and ready to go, I'm ready to start my project. Thank you guys so much for watching and sticking to the end. I will see you guys in the next video.